Hello there, thanks very much for coming to my talk, Second Order Realism and the Tropes versus Universals Dispute. By the way, if you're interested in the paper corresponding to this talk, then you'll find a link to the paper in the description below this video. So second order realists about properties have claimed that their theory affords a theoretically fruitful reshaping of a well-trodden metaphysical landscape, in particular with respect to the Tropes versus Universals dispute. And while I agree with respect to the overriding claim here, I disagree about the result of this shapeshift, and this is what my talk is going to be about. I will start by just briefly explaining what second-order realism about properties consists in. Second-order realism about properties can be seen as an instance of a growing trend in metaphysics that we may call higher orderism, and whose central claim is that metaphysical theories profit from being stated with the help of sui generis higher order quantification. What's higher order quantification? Contrast it with first order quantification, which is of course the well-known type of quantification involved, for example, in this little argument here, where the conclusion existentially generalizes on the singular term Anna in Anna is smart. Then contrasted with second order, or more generally higher order quantification, is quantification into syntactical positions other than those of singular terms. So we would be particularly concerned with second order quantification, which is the type of quantification, for example, featuring in this little argument here, where the conclusion existentially generalizes not on a singular term, but on the first level predicate is smart in the premise. What does it mean to say that higher order quantification is a sui generis form of quantification? Well, briefly put, it means that higher order quantification is neither fully explicable nor reducible to first order quantification. And an important upshot of this conception for our purposes is that, strictly speaking, it's not possible to use a singular term to refer to an entity in the domain of the second order quantifier. So whenever I appear to be doing so, when I, for example, use the singular term, the property of being wise, to refer to an entity in the second order domain, then this should be understood as my attempt to express in English a claim that could be more perspiciously stated in a higher order language. Now, higher order quantification, understood along these lines, has recently been applied to a diverse list of topics in metaphysics, including, for example, essence, the internalism versus externalism debate, the contingentism versus necessitism debate, generalized identity, propositions, and grounding. Now, what I would be concerned with in this talk is the application of higher order quantification to theories of properties, as recently considered by Rob Truman and by Nick Jones, who will be of specific importance for this talk. Now, to bring out what's at issue here, we can follow Jones in taking a first-order realist about properties to endorse a range of instances of this schema here. So the two-place predicate here is to be read as x instantiates y, so that replacing the schematic letter phi with the predicate is red yields this claim here, the claim that necessarily for each red object there is something, the property of redness, which that object instantiates, and necessarily only red objects instantiate that thing. So notice that the properties postulated by the first order realists are first order entities. They are the witnesses for the first order existential quantifier in instances of this schema here endorsed by the first order realist. Now, in contrast to this, second order realists endorse instances of this schema here. So here the first order existential quantifier has made way to a second order quantifier, quantifier into the position of predicates, such as is red, so that the properties postulated by the second order realists are second order entities. They're the witnesses for the second order existential quantifier here in those instances of this schema here, endorsed by second order realists. So why should we be second order realists rather than first order realists? Proponents of second order realism have given two types of arguments, of which the first one is the argument from dissolution. According to that argument, we should be second-order realist because second-order realism dissolves certain otherwise intractable disputes regarding the nature of properties. And a representative example here is the immanentism versus transcendentalism dispute, understood as the dispute over the question whether properties are spatiotemporally located. Now, in brief, the idea here is that second-order realism reveals that dispute as based on a false dilemma. It's based on the assumption that any property realist either has to answer the question after the location of properties negatively or positively. Second-order realists, however, take properties to be entities in the range of a sui generis second-order quantifier, and as we've discussed, they therefore take predicates rather than singular terms to be the entities suitable to facilitate talk about properties. But now it seems that locational vocabulary such as x is located at y is best construed as combinable only with singular terms, not with predicates, right? So the sentence or the string of letters is y is located at this or that location. That's not even a well-formed sentence. Therefore, the argument from dissolution concludes second-order realists are entitled to refuse the question after the location of properties as unintelligible, thereby even evading the need to even engage with it. The second type of argument is the argument from resolution. And according to this argument, we should be second-order realists because this will resolve the otherwise intractable dispute between trope theory and proponents of universals. So what's this dispute about? Well, trope theorists take properties to be unrepeatable entities. No monadic trope, they think, can be instantiated by more than one object. So a first-order trope theorist will endorse a claim like this, which says that whenever some object x instantiates some object y, then it's impossible for any object distinct from x to also instantiate y. First-order universal theorists, in contrast, they will reject this type of claim. They will think that properties can typically be instantiated by more than one object, and indeed that this is sort of the point of properties in the first place. Now, Jones thinks that the debate between first-order trope theory and first-order universal theory has become bogged down in a stalemate. So he thinks that both sides have good arguments for their positions and have good responses to the other party's arguments and so on and so forth, so that there's no reasonable hope to resolve the tropes versus universals dispute anytime soon in a first-order setting. But importantly, he thinks that this is different in a second-order setting. In a second-order setting, Jones thinks that the dispute is in fact easily resolved in favor of universals. For the second-order analog of the characteristic trope theoretical claim is this claim here. And this claim, Jones thinks, is just straightforwardly false. Why is that? Well, because this claim here entails that if an apple A is red, and if an apple B is distinct from an apple A, then B can't also be red. So the claim second-order tropes, unlike the claim first-order trope, conflicts with entirely innocuous truths, such as the truth here that A and B are distinct, but both red. This is why the tropes versus universals dispute is taken to be easily dissolved in a second-order setting, and that this is so is taken to be a reason to be a second-order realist. Now, what I want to do in the remainder of this talk is two things. So first, I will explain why I think that the argument from resolution is ultimately unsuccessful. In brief, this is because I think there's a natural alternative way of setting up a second-order trope theory on which it no longer conflicts with such innocuous truth. Second, and in a more constructive spirit, I will argue that a position incorporating second-order realism can nevertheless still be motivated via its impact on the tropes versus universals dispute. For I think that second-order realism can be used to effect a dissolution rather than a resolution of this dispute as well. So here's why I think the argument from resolution fails. Remember, a crucial part of the argument was that the claim that the principal second-order tropes is straightforwardly false because it entails the straightforwardly false claim that if apple A is red, then a distinct apple B can't also be red. I want to focus on this entailment claim now. And notice that the entailment claim holds if we're presupposing classical rules for the second order quantifiers, but it doesn't hold if we're presupposing free rules for the second order quantifiers. Why is that? Well, first consider the familiar case of free first order logic. In free first order logic, we're allowing terms to be non-denoting, and as a result, we can't here go from a universally quantified statement to an arbitrary instance of it. What we need additionally is an assumption to the effect that the term in question is a denoting term. And similarly for free second order logic, here we're allowing predicates to be non-denoting, and as a result we can't go from a second order universal quantification to an arbitrary instance of it. Here too we need an additional premise to the effect that the relevant predicate is a denoting predicate. Applied to the case at hand, that means that in a free second order logic we can't in fact go from the principal second order tropes alone to the problematic conclusion that if A is red, then a distinct B can't also be red. Here what we need in addition is the assumption that the predicate is red is a denoting predicate. And as we'll see in a minute, a second order trope theorist might not be willing to grant that assumption. So I take this observation to raise the prospect of resisting Jones's argument by developing a more sophisticated version of second order trope theory in a free setting. And I take this prospect to be particularly promising because there are in fact independent reasons for a trope theorist to favor a free setting. And that, in fact, I think there are three such independent reasons, and I discussed them in the paper, but here I'll just mention one very briefly. So it's a well-known fact that classical quantifier rules, when combined with classical or typical standard modal logic, lead to necessitism about the entities in the domain of those quantifiers. But trope theorists will want to be contingentists about their tropes, right? If they were forced to accept that Anna's wisdom trope exists necessarily, they would be forced to accept that Anna is necessarily wise. And that's unacceptable. So they can't, in fact, be necessitists about second order entities, but then they're unlikely to be happy with classical rules for the second order quantifiers anyway. So let me just sketch briefly how such a second order trope theory might look like in a free setting. So let us introduce first for each pair of an ordinary predicate phi and a term t, a new predicate which we might call the particularization of phi to t, and which is stipulated to apply to exactly the things which are both phi and identical to the thing denoted by the term t. So to illustrate, suppose that A and B are the only red objects. Then the particularization of is red to A applies to A and only to A, and the particularization of is red to B applies to B and only to B. The particularization of is red to C, in contrast, doesn't apply to anything because C is not among the red objects. Now, in our free setting, it's open to our trope theorists to only regard certain particularized predicates as standing for tropes. So our trope theorists can maintain that this predicate here stands for a trope and this predicate here also stands for a trope, while simultaneously regarding particularizations of predicates that don't apply to anything as non-denoting predicates, and also regarding non-particularized ordinary predicates as non-denoting predicates. Accordingly, our trope theorists will accept these existential claims here while rejecting these second-order existential claims here. In this setting, our trope theorists can accept the principal second-order tropes without being forced to infer the problematic claim that if apple A is red, then a distinct apple B won't be red. Indeed, if they accept a positive free logic which allows them to regard atomic claims as true, even if they contain a non-denoting predicate, then they will be in a position to simultaneously accept the principal second-order tropes while also regarding as true sentences of this form here. What they, of course, won't be able to accept as true is sentences of this form. So second-order tropes still entail sentences of this form here, and accordingly conflicts with the truth of sentences of this form. But that's not problematic. A trope theory should allow that an ordinary predicate such as is red can apply to more than one thing, but it should not, and indeed it need not and it should not allow that a particularized predicate should apply to more than one object. First set of conclusions. Remember that according to the argument from resolutions, we should be second-order realists because this straightforwardly resolves the dispute between trope theorists and proponents of universals. Now I think this argument fails because the trope versus universals dispute is not in fact straightforwardly solved just by going second order. While the trope theoretical principles we've seen may clash with a classical second order framework, they in fact sit nicely in a free second order framework of the type described, and which second order trope theorists have independent reasons to favor. Of course, that's not to say that we should all be second order trope theorists. The point is just that second order trope theory can be made sufficiently plausible to undermine the argument from resolution for second order realism. A couple of slides is to outline an alternative and, in my view, preferable way of motivating a second-order realist position via its impact on the tropes versus universals dispute. And as I've indicated earlier, I think that we should use the distinction between first-order realism and second-order realism to aim for a dissolution rather than a resolution of this dispute. To see how, let's start by focusing on what might look like a trilemma faced by every property theorist. The first part of the trilemma is that, at least prima facie, it seems preferable not to mix and match universals and tropes. It seems preferable, that is, to advance a pure theory, a theory which either treats all properties as tropes or treats all properties as universals. Second, at least prima facie, there are good reasons to accept tropes, and this just because tropes are better suited for some of the many theoretical roles associated with properties. For instance, it's tropes, not universals, which are best suited for the role of properties as the objects of perception, as reflected in statements such as Anna sees the redness of the apple. Third and finally, again prima facie, there are also good reasons to accept universals. And that's because universals are better suited for some other of the many theoretical roles associated with properties. For instance, it's universals, not tropes, which are best suited for the role of properties as the enablers of genuine commonalities among objects. So it may look as if all property theorists find themselves in a predicament. They're faced with three prima facie attractive desiderata on a theory of properties: allow for universals, allow for tropes, make your theory pure, and these three desiderata cannot be jointly satisfied. And part of the job of any property theorist would then appear to be that of deciding which of these desiderata to reject. However, I think that the distinction between first-order and second-order realism can be used to show that we're here concerned with another instance of a theoretical choice which is only apparently forced on property realists. For once we distinguish between first-order and second-order realism, we should also distinguish between two ways to understand the purity principle. On a weaker reading, all that this principle demands is what I call intra-level purity. No theory should mix first-order tropes with first-order universals or second-order tropes with second-order universals. On a stronger reading, it additionally demands inter-level purity. No theory should mix first-order tropes with second-order universals or first-order universals with second-order tropes. And with this notion of purity in mind, consider a view which I call hybrid realism, and which is realist about tropes and about universals, while taking tropes to be first-order entities, but universals to be second-order entities. So hybrid realism accepts universals and therefore enjoys all the benefits typically associated with universals, but it also accepts tropes and therefore enjoys all the benefits typically associated with tropes. Now, does hybrid realism meet the purity principle? The answer is no longer trivial. Well, it might initially have looked as if any theory meeting any two of these three desiderata would automatically have to flout the third desideratum. That's no longer obvious in this case. While hybrid realism doesn't exhibit interlevel purity, right, it mixes first-order tropes with second-order universals, it does exhibit intra-level purity. It doesn't mix tropes and universals on any one level. And in a sense, intra-level purity is all the purity that can reasonably be required, or so I will argue on the final slide. To see why this is so, we can bring to bear a helpful observation made by Jones in the course of his defense of second-order realism. So Jones points out that the natural language sentence "there are properties" might not be an ideal vehicle to communicate second-order realism, since it would appear to be best formalized with the help of a first-order predicate, a predicate that takes first-order variables as arguments, and a first-order existential quantifier. So what would be needed instead would appear to be a second-order analog of this predicate, a predicate that expresses propertyhood but takes second-order variables. Now, in the same way, we can introduce a pair of first-order predicates, to be read as is a trope and is a universal, and corresponding second-order analogs of these predicates. Hybrid realism's intra-level purity manifests itself in rendering the following two statements true. So according to hybrid realism, all properties are tropes, if by property you mean first-order property, and all properties are universals, if by property you mean second-order universal. So these two statements ensure that all first-order properties are of one kind and all second-order properties are of one kind. Now, the impression that hybrid realism is still lacking in purity is likely to be grounded in the idea that one could intelligibly require a theory to sort of additionally assure that all first-order properties and all second-order properties taken together are of one kind. Perhaps by rendering true a statement like this one here, which says that everything that is either a first-order property or a second-order property is of some kind, f. But in fact, there is no coherent such request to be made. The precise formulation of this statement here would require what cannot be done. It would require simultaneously quantifying into the position of a first-order variable in this predicate here and quantifying simultaneously into the position of a second-order variable in this predicate here. So I think this way a hybrid realist can, I think, effectively diffuse the impression that their position is in any coherent sense lacking purity. I'm gonna briefly wrap up. So I've been arguing for two main claims. The first one is that second-order realism doesn't resolve the tropes versus universals dispute. The second claim, however, is that the distinction between first-order realism and second-order realism can still be used to dissolve rather than resolve the dispute between tropes and universals, because the position which I've called hybrid realism and which I've just sketched, which involves first-order tropes and second-order universals, that position combines the advantages both of tropes and of universals while simultaneously exhibiting all the purity that can coherently be required. Cool. So that's it. Thanks very much for your attention. Please feel free to get in touch with feedback or questions either via the comments section or by sending me an email. Thanks.